Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, this is Orphanlast, aka Skylar Madison, and today we're going to start animating the brickfall animation, now that all the prep work is done. First, let's discuss the timeline and how everything is organized into the scene. First of all, I decided to work with the version of the background that only has the bookshelf and the bookshelf alone, and separated into two other levels is the books on one level and the bricks on another. Now, occasionally, if you look at the timeline and you see a software-oriented keyframe on the timeline that I just didn't mention earlier, don't worry about it. There was tons of experimentation with this as I was going along. So I won't be mentioning things that just didn't work out. I don't want to keep wasting your guys' time. Right now, though, one thing that you can do is you can actually select the bookcase and just put it onto its own level on the timeline. I don't want to just confuse you guys. So you guys are already familiar with the workflow. If you've been following this channel, you're already familiar with the workflow of how to select something on one level and cut it out. Like Control C, and then create another vector level or raster level, whatever form of level that you're working with, and then just paste in that information in there and be able to work with it from there. So the first thing that I focused on was making some manual keyframes for the brick. Some of this was just me copying and pasting the brick around. For the second keyframe, I decided its exact location where the brick would reach the edge of the shelf, and it'd be just before it'd start to rotate and fall. And that was my second keyframe. And also on the second keyframe, I made sure I'd draw out the full brick. And there comes a point where the shelf gets in the way of my drawing process for the brick. So I selected the level I was working on in the level strip, and basically that just grays out everything. It goes ahead and gets rid of everything else in the scene so that I could just see only and just what's on that level. And this way I could just draw on that level and see only what's on that level. This is a really helpful thing to be able to do. One thing that I find helpful so that I don't always have to keep fiddling with the image with the control point editor is drawing things out a little, even if it just means being a little sloppy with my lines, just making my lines a bit longer than they need to be. And basically, after I'm done drawing everything out, I basically select all the lines that I just drew out and then go to Edit and then Remove Overflow. And it'll usually get rid of the extra length to the lines after they start to intersect with one another, and it can really save you time. I mean, rather than messing around with the control point editor for forever, you just get it all kind of taken care of all in one fell swoop. I then made a raster level and called it Arcs, and started to draw out the path the brick would take throughout this animation. This is part of the sketching process, and sometimes these arcs wind up evolving as you're animating, because sometimes you find something that just works better as you're drawing out each frame. But by and large, you want to keep drawing out your arcs. You want to make sure that you know where you're going, and that's exactly what your arcs do. Now, there are some master animators out there that don't necessarily draw out their arcs, but unless you've been doing this for 20 years, I think you probably should. For my third keyframe, I drew out this brick that went towards the vanishing point that relates to everything else in the scene. But later, much later in this video, in the animation process, I found that this really didn't work out. But that's fine, because at least the keyframe there served as a point of reference so that I could have some help keeping the same volume for the brick throughout the entire animation process, so that I knew the general area I wanted the brick to fall towards and land at. I also started to draw some arcs that were a different color that represented the top and bottom of the brick as it'd be rotating through the animation. It's at this point that I spaced out my manual keyframes on the timeline. I didn't have any set time that I wanted these keyframes to sit on, but I do have an idea as to what the timing is now that I have the keyframes all laid out. The most important actions of the brick are all laid out, and so that's a big step in getting your timing all laid out as well. I created the animation for the brick slowly sliding towards the edge of the shelf just by copying the brick, pasting it into another frame on the timeline, and pressing on the arrow keys on my keyboard. I really wanted it to be a slow movement, so I really didn't move it that much from one frame to the next. I also made sure that I was working with the full brick that I drew out for my second keyframe for this whole process. Now, yours may not quite look the way mine does throughout this specific step, because if you look at the timeline, there's a software keyframe that I mentioned earlier, and it's on the first frame of my bookshelf column. It's because I messed with the Z-axis positioning of the bookshelf, which means that I moved the object closer to the camera in the 3D mode. Eventually, I got rid of this technique and I just decided to use a mat. Sometimes just working with the simplest thing just works out the best. I'll get into talking how I created the mat in a bit, so don't worry too much right now if you're able to see the bottom of the brick through this specific part of the process. At first I tried out animating the brick sliding on the bookshelf on 3s, but I felt like it was a little too jittery. It just kept kind of jittering about, so I settled on it being animated on 2s. That seemed like it started to work out quite a bit. The next step was working on making the brick rotate as it starts to fall off the bookshelf. I found that copying and pasting the original brick and trying to rotate it really did not work out. But like Adam Earl says, a lot of people's frustration with animation is that they actually think the computer will be able to do most of the animating for them. So if you're finding that you're having to do things manually, you're an animator, you're an artist, you're supposed to be ready to draw at a moment's notice. Now, I really didn't work with many extremes throughout this animation. A lot of this animation was straight ahead animation. I then create a vector level and call it matte, because I need to mask off the bottom of the brick as it slides along the shelf. And this is how you do it. I created a green style because in Hollywood oftentimes they use green screens in order to matte things out from the camera. I then draw a line and then start using the control point editor to shape the matte. At this point, I was trying to be super exact with the matte, but what I found is that you really don't need to be exact at this point. Just get it in the ballpark. And once you get the nodes all set up in the effects schematic and are able to view the animation in preview mode with the matte, you can just adjust the matte in the preview mode and see how it affects the pixels on the screen. In the animation tab, I go ahead and create a matte. Now, if you feel confused about the whole process of creating a matte after watching this video, I actually already have a video about how to create a matte, so you can go ahead and go back and take a look at that. Basically, once I go into the animation tab, I find my brick node and my matte node from the effects schematic. You want to go matte out, then you want to make sure that the matte extends for the full extent of the animation that you want the matte to function as a matte on the timeline. Then you want to plug the matte node into the matte plug on the matte effects node. And you want to plug your brick into the source on the matte effects node. Then plug the matte effects node into the X sheet node. Make sure the brick node and the matte column node don't connect directly into the X sheet node at all. At this point, I found that the mat was covering too much of the brick in the preview mode, so I pulled out my control point editor and made some little adjustments, and until basically the pixelated preview mode version of the animation looked just right. At this point, I felt like I needed a bit of an extreme image for the end of the initial rotation of the brick. So I started to use my arcs and just refined them a bit for what I needed. Using arcs is part of the sketching process of animation, and if you can't visualize the arcs on your own, it's best you draw them out and work with them as best as you can. Now, I didn't use any moving vanishing points or anything. I just worked by freehand, and I still think that everything turned out looking pretty good. Once my extreme image was finished, I spaced it out a bit on the timeline so that I could draw some in-betweens. I made some good use of my onion skins to guide me in the process as well, and while animating, it's best to make sure that you review your animation frequently. Finish a drawing, play your animation. Finish a drawing, play your animation. Finish a drawing, play your animation. Make sure that the volume of your brick is consistent, that the size and shape of it is consistent throughout the entire animation. Make sure your spacing is just right, that it doesn't start to jitter about or look weird. Make sure you don't have any lines that start popping around unpredictably. Make sure that you didn't just draw the brick doing something that's not physically possible. Make a drawing, play the animation. Make a drawing, play the animation, and repeat, repeat, repeat. There's basically a lot that can go wrong in an animation, and if you only review your animation after making 5 to 10 drawings, it's harder for you to identify the drawings, or just even if it's just one drawing, that's causing the problem. It's hard for you to identify what it is, which one it is. And so, you'll wind up sloppily trying to fix every frame until none of the animation looks right. So it's best to just make a drawing, play the animation, until you can actually see anything that's wrong with it. If I'm getting annoying because I'm being repetitive, it's on purpose. It's because this is important. Just make sure the animation works one drawing at a time. Now that Opentoonz is now at 1.1.3, it's come a long ways since 1.1.2 in terms of stability, so animating in rasters is now actually a practical thing to do. I think that I'm going to start doing a lot more animating in rasters rather than in vectors, because during the times I was practicing off camera, I had a hell of a time working with the coloring process of these vectors. Back during 1.1.2, it was as if you wanted it to animate anything in rasters, the program would just crash every single time in something like 10 seconds. But now with 1.1.3, I'm pleasantly surprised at how stable it is with rasters. I'm actually in talks right now with the Mrevna guys, asking them to bid about how much it would cost to get physical fills into the program for vector work, which basically involves me doing tons of research on how other vector drawing and animation programs do it, and explain how I'd like it to work in basically with vectors, and how I would want them to work in Opentoonz. Of course, there are no promises here. We won't get physical fills in Opentoonz unless, there's a programmer that actually wants to take on that much of a workload, and most especially unless they actually are able to get the funding to make it happen. And I suspect that what I'm talking about here, getting physical fills in Opentoonz, the one thing that would, in my opinion, fix the worst part of Opentoonz, that thing right there, I suspect it's a rather large overhaul, and I don't think that it'd be cheap. So if you guys are interested in that, please leave a comment in the comment section, because I am so tired of fighting the vector work and fighting the fill tool and trying to find out what sort of stupid logic it's going under that makes no sense. But basically, like I said, we won't be able to get it if we can't get funding. But yeah, it's all up to you guys if you think it's worth your time to struggle with the fill tool. as it stands, or if you think it's better to invest in something that will actually make things a time saver. Something about animating this brick didn't feel right when it comes to drawing out a bunch of extremes. It seemed like the physics of the brick needed to be organic and free, and drawing a bunch of extremes seemed like it would limit that. It would seem like me trying to force the brick to do something that it wouldn't do naturally. So, yet again, I did a ton of straight-ahead animation. I started cross-hatching the arc for the brick's fall and made sure that I spaced the hatches close to each other during the beginning of the fall and spaced them out more towards the end of the fall, to the point to where it wound up colliding with the ground. Plotting your animation out like this with the arcs really helps with your easing in, easing out, speeding in, speeding out sort of spacing. In this case, this was strictly an ease-in animation, where the brick slowly gains momentum for its fall and abruptly collides with the ground and stops. I didn't see any need to do any squash and stretch animation here. The brick is a rather stiff object, so it wouldn't have any squash and stretch plasticity. So at this point, I'm really happy with how the brick fall animation is turning out. Technically speaking, I'm done with this animation challenge, but because the brick just fell off a shelf. But I'm in it to be a quality animator. I've actually searched on YouTube for 51 great animation exercises and found a number of people who've basically done the same animations and posted them publicly. I mean, they're fine for what they are. Everyone's got their own skill level and stuff like that. That's great. I don't know how old they are or how much practice they've had in drawing in general or animating in general. I've been drawing my whole life, whereas I have only a little bit of animation experience. You know, everyone's played around with a flip book at some point in time, I think. And I don't want to be one of those guys that do all the steps of becoming a great animator but doesn't actually put any effort into being a great animator. So I'll be back with this animation so that I can animate these books and having them push the brick off the shelf. What I can tell you about what you can expect from that video when I start animating the books as of right now is I've done a bit of experimentation with the books, and what it all really entails is this. I'm going to have to animate each and every book individually. Just like what Adam Earl says, you can't expect the computer to do all of the work, especially when you start rotating objects. In my opinion, there's no problem trying to see if there's a way that the computer can do the work for you, but if you realize, like, you need to be able to recognize when the computer can't, and be excited for when it's time for you to start drawing. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't, please like, share, and subscribe anyways. Have a great day.